right, should we get started?
Let's do it.
Hey everyone, welcome to what I like to call the digital version of Katmai National Park here in Alaska. I'm Ranger Daniel.
I'm Ranger Becca.
Today we're going to be talking about bears and salmon, things like that as usual, but we're going to be answering some questions about geology as well, right?
That's right, and our changing landscape that we can see right here in the Lower Brooks River.
So we'll be jumping behind the camera here in a minute to talk about that. We're going to be looking at the bears that we're seeing in the area, and we're going to be talking about how this changing landscape affects them, affects their main food source, the salmon. And we'll try and answer your questions, and we're also going to ask some questions as we go along as well. So, like I said, we're here in Katmai National Park. This is a big national park. If you're joining us for the first time, then you should know that we are in a very remote place. This is not an easy place to do a webcast from.
Indeed.
So there might be some technical difficulties as we go along. We have some foul weather at play. There is a big rainstorm over there. I hope it's moving in the other direction. The wind is picking up. But this is typical of the Alaskan Peninsula. And so these cameras are provided by Explore.org. So if you're watching us on Facebook, you should know that you can go to Explore.org and you can watch these webcasts all the time from there. They've got we've got 6 cameras around Katmai National Park here, and then they have cameras all around the world. So there's a lot of cool stuff to see.
Yeah.
And this is something that we do normally every week or more often. We have some rangers jump on the cameras and answer questions, talk about things that have been going on here in Katmai National Park. So we're going to be talking about changes in the river. Maybe you want to give us like an overview of that real quick. What are we going to be learning?
Yeah. So, from this vantage point, we can look out on the Lower Brooks River and we can see some pretty cool bear activity. And if you've watched this at all before, maybe you've noticed some of the changes, not only in the river itself, but also in the behavior of the bears that use the river. So we'll talk about some of those changes as we get into our web chat today. We also want to pose a question to you, the audience, before we get started here. Since the bears that we see along the Brooks River have to change their behavior to adapt to the changes in the river, what landscape changes do you have to adapt to in your own lives? Yeah.
I like this question. I have a lot of answers of my own.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I'm very interested to read everyone's answers in the comments below. So if you're watching on Explore.org, you'll notice that all the comments down below the video feed there. Write your answer in the comments. We'll be browsing through as we go, and we'll try and read some of the good ones if we can get to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, we're going to move the camera up, we'll step behind the camera, and we'll start talking about the things that we're seeing in front of us, or behind us right now, that is. All right, so here we go.
Alrighty.
Now, while I'm moving this, let me say that it might not be perfect. We might have to jostle the camera a little bit here every now and then. We're on a platform elevated up in the air that allows us to view the bears in this area safely. We're about 10 feet off the ground on this big wooden platform, and we've been seeing a lot of bears in the area. There were some walking right below us just a minute ago.
Yeah, there have been a number of sows with their cubs especially, and we've seen a number of different bears bring their cubs, sometimes right beneath the platform. The most recent group is the one that you're looking at right now there. They came from farther downriver, walked right below where we're standing, and then continued upriver there to wherever it is that they're investigating now.
And so if we stop talking for a minute, if you hear some dead air for a little bit, don't worry. We do have a lot of technical difficulties from time to time, but most likely we're just enjoying the bears like you are. But we'll be talking on and off for the next hour. We'll be wrapping things up in about 60 minutes. All right, should we jump into it? Changes in the river, the lower river landscape here. Things, what comes to mind for me is the only thing constant is change. The water's gotten a lot higher this year. The islands are always shifting and moving. The river isn't following one simple course here, is it?
No, certainly not. And the lower river has experienced some pretty dramatic change if we look at the past few thousand years. So, this whole area that we're in right now in Katmai National Park, it's a glacially sculpted landscape. And if we could travel back in time, in fact, something like maybe 30,000 years, if we were standing here in this spot, we would be underwater. underwater. That long ago, Naknek Lake, which is just below the Brooks River here, it was about 175 feet higher in water level than what it is today. So the Brooks River didn't exist at all at that time. Naknek Lake was so large that it incorporated a lot of the other lakes around it, including Brooks Lake, which right now is the beginning of Brooks River. So it wasn't a river at all. It was just sort of an extension of Naknek Lake, in fact.
That's really interesting. You know, we've seen so many dramatic changes just this season. It's a good reminder to think, you know, on a geologic scale, these changes are pretty minor.
Right. And some of the changes that we might recognize in the river, you know, today, they might be part of a smaller, maybe seasonal change. But right, exactly, if we sort of expand the scope and investigate a geologic timescale, we're looking at some much larger changes that happened on that greater timescale, indeed.
So you said 175 feet higher water level?
That's right.
On Naknek Lake?
On Naknek Lake,
so
yeah.
Naknek Lake, I'm going to turn the camera around here. Allow me to... That's back there. That's Naknek Lake's waters, and this is the mouth of the river. And you can see that the lake water is high enough that it influences the river to some extent in this area here. But so 175 feet, the tops of those trees over there would certainly be underwater.
Right. And some other things that we see today above the level of the river would also be underwater. If you've watched these cams before, perhaps you have seen Brooks Falls, or maybe you've even seen it in person. Today we recognize it as a 6-foot tall waterfall along the Brooks River. It's just about maybe half a mile from where we are right now, but farther up on the river's course. And about 30,000 years ago, with the water level of Naknek Lake being so much higher, the waterfall wouldn't have existed at all. That rocky outcrop that we see the water traveling over today would have been far under the level of the lake. So Brooks Falls wouldn't have been there. You know, we wouldn't have seen the number of salmon trying to jump up the waterfall that we see today. And we also wouldn't have seen this concentration of brown bears in this area. You know, there wasn't a bottleneck of migrating salmon to attract bears in, so there was likely no reason for them to stick around and search for food. Oh, we're hearing some bear activity farther down that way. Some bears that are probably currently searching for food, which they have the opportunity to do because the river level is lower. So without Brooks Falls there, of course, we wouldn't have seen bears around at the time, but the water level started to drop. That was, you know, a few thousand years ago. And Brooks Falls itself probably was exposed maybe around 3,000 years ago, so still quite a while ago. And that's maybe when salmon first started to encounter this barrier in their upriver migration.
But so the salmon would have still been here as much as millions of years ago, perhaps, right? That they just would have been... They wouldn't have been channeled into this narrow river where it's easy for the bears to catch them.
Right, yeah, I imagine it would have been pretty different for salmon traveling upriver with that much higher water level. Maybe a little bit easier, if I was to guess. But yeah, a smaller water course means maybe more salmon trying to flow through that same space and needing to negotiate obstacles like Brooks Falls itself. So maybe this change in the river level, it's been maybe not so great for the salmon, but it's created a fantastic opportunity for bears to come here and enjoy the fishing opportunities at Brooks Falls. And hey, it's also brought a pretty cool opportunity for people to come and watch those bears.
Yeah, let's break that down a little bit more. Let's go into that for those just joining, those people, those who are new to the Brooks River area. Why do we have so many bears here, and what's the deal with all these salmon? Some of those things.
Yeah, so we find ourselves along the Brooks River, which flows into Naknek Lake, and Naknek Lake eventually connects up with Bristol Bay. And Bristol Bay is the scene of one of the largest salmon runs in the world, so we get some of those salmon that will come all the way up to where we are right now. And in July, we'll tend to see the sockeye salmon run. So sockeye salmon will be traveling up from the ocean, traveling upriver and through these lakes to reach their spawning grounds. And this presents an opportunity for brown bears to visit the area looking for their favorite fish, sockeye salmon, something that can help nourish them as they are on their path towards surviving hibernation. So at the Brooks River, we find that it's one of the earlier places that we might see brown bears appearing in large numbers as they're coming out of hibernation. And in July, when we reach the peak of the salmon run, we we reach the peak of numbers of bears up at the falls, we also tend to see our peak visitation numbers as people come in to watch those bears. And it makes for a pretty exciting, pretty dynamic environment. And there are some people who have been coming here to the Brooks River for decades, and so they've been able to witness some of the changes that we've seen along the Brooks River too.
I've been seeing there's some ripples from one of those salmon just jumping right there, and you can see the slight darker discoloration in the water. Those are the red sockeye salmon actually themselves right there. Well, I've got some comments from people who answered your question, Becca.
Oh, exciting.
Stacy says that she lives in western Massachusetts and that they're in a drought there.
Oh.
So no watering is allowed. So that, that's just the first part of this, but that's a change right there. You wouldn't, changes to your climate can ultimately cause changes to your landscape, to the geology of an area.
Indeed.
But she says that she went on a hike yesterday that normally circles a pond. The pond is dry.
Interesting.
So those are some interesting changes.
Huh.
And then some people talked about the droughts and the changes to the landscape in California as well. B has a comment that loss of nature, encroaching development, the local orange groves have disappeared where they live, and that human development has changed the landscape around them and where they live.
Interesting. Yeah, certainly, and whether those changes to your landscape are natural or human caused, they can certainly affect the way that humans behave within that landscape. So, right, if you are used to growing something in particular in your garden and you're faced with a drought, you might adjust what you choose to grow in your garden. Bears here are not tending their own gardens. Instead, they're fishing the Brooks River for their food source. But like people might need to change their behavior with their changing environment, so too are the bears. And so this year, as we've mentioned, there have been some pretty high water levels in the lower river area. And in July especially, I noticed that a lot of areas that I would have expected to see underwater much later in the season were already underwater. And so the bears that were coming into this area in July were maybe faced with higher water levels than expected. And perhaps that affected their fishing techniques. I don't know if we've seen any bears so far today diving under the water to try to catch salmon that are towards the bottom of the river. But if you can imagine, higher water levels maybe would have given salmon more escape routes. So if a brown bear was trying to catch some salmon in the river, it might have to adjust its fishing techniques.
It's interesting. Yeah, we all have to adapt and change to the world around us. There's certain things that you can't change. If the river wants to flow a certain way, it's often not possible to make it flow another way.
Exactly.
Barbara commented that she lives in Florida, and hurricanes cause a lot of flooding, big storms like that. It changes the way you have to go about your daily life if you live in a place like Florida. And there's nothing you can't put up a wall or any kind of barrier to stop a hurricane.
Right.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
We've had some big storms here too this summer that have caused some changes. Right. There was people have noticed a lot of new driftwood in the lower river.
Yeah, we'll get on some days with strong east winds. We'll get a lot of wave action coming up from Naknek Lake. And so one of the biggest changes that I have seen along the lower Brooks River this year is actually on the other side of the bridge over by where we, the rangers, stand when we're over standing on the corner, as we call it. So the wave action coming up from Naknek Lake has eaten away at some of the ground there, and it's caused erosion, I think, of maybe something like 6 feet of trail over on that side. And as one of the people who stands over there from time to time, I can't help but notice that the ground is literally disappearing beneath my feet. And so as we see those strong waves coming in, that's certainly affecting our landscape. The higher water levels have also sort of changed some of the islands that we're looking at out here. Right now on the left-hand side, we see a couple of islands that we call upriver islands, and they're pretty well flooded at this time of year. And we've got some other features over on the other side of the bridge, an area called the Closed Trail, which is usually above water for the entire season. But this season we've noticed that it's been overrun by the river itself, and so we're seeing a lot of driftwood and other things collecting over that way. And I've seen some bears that will go and swim across that sort of gap right there that we can see in the camera. So I wonder if bears have had to adjust the way that they swim through the lower river as they have encountered these new islands or disappearing islands.
Yeah, we've been talking about that on the cams lately. We've been kind of wondering and speculating because it's not really possible to know what the bears are thinking. But on some of those big east wind days after storms pushed a lot of floating pumice and driftwood into the lower river, you can imagine that it could block off some of the areas where salmon might normally, dead salmon might collect for the bears to eat. But by and large, the bears are pretty adaptable, and just like us, when their landscape changes, they're able to adjust and act accordingly and find a way.
Right, and I think that's honestly one of their big tickets for survival, is the resiliency of these bears and their ability to face some of these challenges that they might encounter and find a way to still survive.
Getting a lot of good rain out here today too. How do the bears, how are they affected by the rain? Some say that bears don't like wind, but I've never seen a bear seem to mind the rain.
I haven't necessarily noticed that either. I imagine that if I had a good thick fur coat like they do, maybe I wouldn't be too bothered by the rainfall either.
All right, well, I have some questions from viewers for you. You ready for them, Becca?
I'm ready.
Okay, here's a good one. This is kind of a big picture question, but we've been talking about this already. So, could rising sea levels affect Brooks Camp? A lot of people have heard about climate change, global warming. The planet is heating up due to agriculture, industry, transportation, these things warming our planet. And with that, we have ice caps and glaciers are melting, and we're getting the sea levels are rising. We're not at sea level here, but we're pretty close. Can you imagine a future where this river environment is affected by rising sea levels?
Right. I mean, I think being able to look towards the past as a way to sort of gauge what could potentially happen in the future. If we can envision a Naknek lake that was 175 feet higher than what we see today, we are, what did we say, maybe 60 feet above sea level or so right here. And so, I don't know what the likelihood is that we might see a return to that epically large Naknek Lake, but I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility. I could certainly see that there could be a situation where rising sea levels would certainly affect our water levels here at Brooks Camp.
It's the first thing that we could expect to happen would be the salty ocean water, saline water, just rising up into the watershed. Right now, it goes several miles, maybe a dozen miles, even up the Naknek River, which is still quite far from here. But it does that salty water mixes with the fresh water for quite a ways, and the Naknek River is tidal. It is affected by the tides for several miles. This is not inside Katmai National Park, but right outside our border. And so you could imagine that just moving upstream as sea levels rose. Well, we were just mentioning. I'll turn the camera over to it. Some of the disappearing trail and how some of big storms and high water on Naknek Lake has caused erosion back there. You can see I'm pointing the camera at some trees that are underwater. Someone was asking about the trails over there that you said, some things have been eroded away.
Yeah.
Will the Park Service reconstruct those, or is it a natural event and therefore something to be preserved?
Right. So there's sort of a balance here between preserving a natural process and making sure that Brooks Camp can still function as a place where visitors can come and visit the natural resource. And over there by where we stand, that place that we call Corner, that area that has been eroding, our maintenance crew has worked really hard this entire season to try to make sure that that area of land doesn't wash away and that people are still able to cross this floating bridge that we see down there before us. So already they installed a longer bridge ramp because as these waves were coming in and carving away part of that trail, it was stranding the bridge. So if you wanted to cross the bridge, you actually had to get your feet wet, which I think sort of added to the whole adventure and thrill of coming out here to Katmai and coming to visit the bears. But it also made it somewhat challenging, especially as we still tried to operate Brooks Camp as normal. So the corner is probably an area where the park will add some gravel again, so that next year we'll still be able to use it, that it won't wash away completely, and that way we can still operate as a place where visitors can come and visit. An area that probably will have a little bit less of an influence on is this part that's just left of the bridge gate that you can see there on the screen. And that's the area that we call the closed trail. That's the area that I've noticed the water has come up and over this year. And so that's a spot where we don't really go out there too often. It's not a huge part of managing Brooks Camp. And so that I think we're going to leave to the river. We're going to let that part go and let the bears continue to swim right over. It's been interesting. I don't know if you've seen this, Daniel, but bears that will go all the way to the end of the closed trail and look down as they're looking for fish. And so I think it's still a good vantage point for them to use as they search for salmon.
Yeah, I think so. We could say that the closed trail is really a peninsula, and as it kind of juts into the channel of the river there. I'm zooming in right on the end of it. Mm-hmm. And it used to go out quite a bit farther. There's not riverbed. Under the water right there where I've got the camera pointed is not really a historic riverbed. It's the extension of the closed trail. And so there's a lot of vegetation and debris down under the water right there. One could speculate that that's a perfect spot for aging, dying salmon to be caught. And so if you're watching a bear pause for a while at the end of the closed trail, it might be looking for salmon caught in the vegetation under the water there. Yeah, people were asking though what the most dramatic change you've seen on the lower river is, Becca, and maybe that's it, the disappearance of closed trail. It used to be a peninsula, and then it kind of became an island.
Yeah. And it's also, I think it's, on a very windy day where the east wind pushes, waves up into the lower river area here, it'll also turn the floating bridge into something of a carnival ride. People maybe witnessed this earlier this summer. I certainly tried to walk out onto the bridge and found myself needing to hold on to the rail lest I be tossed about by all of the wave action. And
it was really going up and down that day.
Yeah, it was pretty fun. Again, adding to the adventure and thrill of visiting Brooks Camp. But I do think that since Corner is a place that I spend a lot of time, I think that has been the most dramatic change I've witnessed since I've been probably the closest to it. And Daniel, you were mentioning the area near the end of the closed trail island, I suppose, being a place where bears could search for fish. And in fact, that whole S-shaped curve that's just there by the end of closed trail, it sort of curves around the backside of it and continues up the river. Yeah, we're getting a sense of it right there now. That S-shaped curve is a feature that we, the rangers, call the channel. And 30 years ago, that channel wasn't there at all. There was an extension of an island that the river did not travel through. But talking about the changes in the lower river area, as the river changed its course, it carved out a new path and created that S-shaped curve. And today, that's certainly a path that I'll see bears swimming through as they're searching for salmon. It seems that some bears kind of make it a path, almost like swimming laps around islands. And they'll travel through the channel and search for the salmon that are maybe collecting down there. So I think that the bears that visit the Brooks River, they've certainly been able to take advantage of some of these new paths that the river has created. And that way they can continue their search for food and survive yet another winter.
That's interesting that we can, so right here what we're looking at on the camera, this kind of S of water that you can see, if we were to find a historic photo from 30 or 40 years ago of the lower river, the lower Brooks River here, that wouldn't be there.
That's right. Yeah.
What was there instead?
Well, just, an island, really. If you can imagine that C-shaped island and that end of the closed trail sort of connected in one greater grassy body, that's kind of what we would have seen.
And the main channel of the river then was just this back over here. It curved around like that.
Yep, that's right. That is what it did.
And that's still the widest channel of the river, and has a lot of the water, but it's not it doesn't have as much current maybe as over here does today. So this place is constantly changing. One thing I wanted to zoom in while we were talking about this is on the grass. You can see what I've been calling a bathtub ring. You see where the grass is dead up to a certain point. That's how high the water was. The water was a lot higher. It's still pretty high, but it's been going down lately, and you can see that it was 6 inches to a foot higher just a few weeks ago, and the grass has kind of stained that color. You can see just even the past couple days that you can see where the grass is wet. It's already gone down.
And so that sort of change, right, is happening pretty quickly right now, and it's a change that we might see happening every single season, so year after year. And that's probably a type of landscape change that the brown bears of the Brooks River are pretty well suited to adjust to. There have been some other changes that have occurred on this landscape within the past few decades that I think have been a little bit of a larger scale, and so bears that have encountered those changes maybe have to adjust a bit more rapidly or a bit more dramatically. And one of the changes, one of the human-caused changes to the landscape down here in the lower Brooks River is the floating bridge itself. So the floating bridge that we see today...
We can move the camera and point it over here at the
Well,
bridge.
fantastic. So the floating bridge that we have right now that you can see there in the camera's view, this is sitting up on some pontoons, and so there are actually spaces beneath the bridge that bears will swim through. They can go between the pontoons, their heads will stay above water, and they can travel right underneath the bridge. And there are some bears that will do exactly that.
Let me guess, that has not always been that way then, I guess.
You got it, Daniel.
Not only is the river changing, but the bridge has changed as well.
Exactly. Yeah, so one of the first versions of the floating bridge that used to be here across the river, it didn't have that space underneath, and it wasn't quite so fortified with those gates and the railings there on the side. And bears are capable of learning, they are food motivated, and they sure are intelligent. So some bears would go right up onto the floating bridge and use that as a fishing platform. They could maybe better see the salmon, get on top, and then hopefully be better able to catch their salmon. With this new one, I think it's harder for bears to use that human structure as a fishing platform, which is probably good for us, since we as people might want to cross the bridge. But there are some bears that have gained access to even this version of the floating bridge, and I've seen them do exactly that same thing. They've looked through the side railings, looked down on the salmon, and then have tried to capture salmon from there. There are some bears, though, that seem like they are uncomfortable, perhaps, swimming underneath the bridge. I know that there's bear 879. It seems that every time he swims down or upriver, when he gets to the bridge, he gets up, goes around, and goes back into the water.
We see some bears will swim under, but they still, on occasion, will walk around. It seems to just whatever mood they're in, whether or not they'll swim under or not. That's interesting to think about the bears being just so capable of adapting to changes. They're used to this, evolutionarily speaking. They're animals that are used to this area changing, and when the humans change it by adding a platform or this bridge across the river, that they're able to respond to that and use it to their advantage, using it as a fishing platform, like you talked about, or now just not letting it bother them too much and swimming right on under it. We should, while we have the chance, zoom in. We've got some bears here out in the mouth of the river, swimming around. Sow and a cub. So why would bears swim out there? If you're just joining us, I'll say that I'm Ranger Daniel, and I'm here talking with Ranger Becca, and we're talking about changes in the lower river, but we're also talking about bears and salmon. And that's exactly what those bears are doing. They're trying to catch salmon, maybe just doing some playing while they're out there. But the lower river is a great place for sows with cubs to catch salmon, and ends up being a great food area for them. We can see a plane coming in right behind them there. The telephoto lens makes it look a lot closer than it is.
Right.
Got a lot of distance between them.
Yeah, in that area where we can see those bears right now, I think oftentimes when we look at bears from here on the raised platform, it seems like they might be far out in the water, that it must be really deep, but there's a sandbar that is over near where those bears are right now, so it might be a bit shallower than what you expect. Again, some of these historic photos that we see of Brooks Camp, they show some of the changes that have occurred in the landscape down here. That sandbar where the bears are right now, which that sandbar is underwater, used to be above water and was a pretty prominent feature of the lower river here. Folks used to park their boats in a cove that was right over that way. But now with that area sort of opened up, the water traveling over, bears can use it as a place to go swimming and play with one another, which is what we were just witnessing there. With the higher water level, it does seem like bears might have to dive under the water perhaps a bit more in order to reach some of the salmon that are in the river here. And so I know I've seen some bears, especially bear 435, Holly. She's really good at diving completely underwater so that she can get some of the fish that have maybe died and their bodies are on the riverbed. Other bears maybe don't dive quite as much.
Yeah, I'll say that the bears all seem to have kind of their own preferences, their own techniques, and just skills that they develop and get good at. A lot of them you'll see using multiple strategies, different techniques to catch fish, but they can, as individuals, tend to have specific preferences or things that they go back to. And so certain bears will see diving underwater a lot. Other bears will see more hesitant to do that, and they'll find other strategies to get fish. And we especially see those different strategies at the falls. But as you watch the cams on explore.org, this is you have a great chance to watch this lower river this fall and see the different strategies that the bears are using down here on the lower river as well. Right now we can look at the water and you can see kind of the dark maroon patches, gray, outside of the greenish water. That's all fish. Those are all salmon schooling up down in there. So there's a lot of fish down there for the bears to be eating.
And I know that, as you mentioned, the different strategies and fishing techniques that these bears have, Daniel, some people have asked if you're worried at all that the river will change faster than the bears can adjust.
That's a good question.
Yeah, what do you think? Are they capable of adjusting enough to this changing landscape? Do you think it'll have a negative impact?
I think that there probably are changes that could happen too fast. Changes to the climate changes in human development if we're not careful and cautious about what we do. But that in general, these bears have been here a long time, longer than us, and that they're very adaptive creatures. And I think that any changes to this lower river they'll be able to handle, because bears are also ready and willing to move to new areas if they need to. There's a lot of other rivers in this area, and I could see that if such a change so dramatic that the bears needed to leave the area, that they'd be able to, and they'd be able to find a productive fishing area elsewhere in Katmai National Park without much trouble. So
Right.
I'm not too worried about the river adapting faster than them.
Fair enough.
Or changing faster.
And it does seem like there are individual bears that we see, today that maybe go somewhere else some summers, but then we'll see them come back. I'm thinking specifically of bear 854 Divot. I don't believe we saw her at all this July, but she returned in September with her 3 spring cubs. And she's a bear that we have seen along the Brooks River in July before. So why she chose to not stay here along the Brooks River this past July, I don't think we'll necessarily ever know the answer, but the fact that we're seeing her again is certainly a demonstration that, her ability to adjust to changing conditions, or exactly as you say, being able to find a different area to go and successfully fish, that's a great strategy for her survival and possibly for the survival of her cubs as well.
Yeah. Well, I've got another question here. Someone was asking why is the water so high this year? We explained that it is.
That's right.
We've explained some of the effects of that, but why is it? Maybe we can both. I'll just say the fact that I think is important in understanding the high river level is that Alaska just had the warmest spring on record. The spring this year, March, April, and May, was warmer than any other spring in Alaska's history. So that got us to higher river levels and higher lake levels much earlier than is normal, because it is normal for the river to get pretty high, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I think that we can consider too, not only with this warm spring, is that the winter we had this past year was a fairly wet winter.
It's pretty wet.
Yeah, and we didn't see the level of snowfall that we would have expected down here at Brooks Camp or over in King Salmon, but up in the higher mountains, snowfall was significant. So when you pair that large snowfall with that warm spring, right, we saw a lot of melt that came in and seemed to fill Naknek Lake a lot earlier than expected. I do remember around the end of May, many of the staff of interpretation went off for a backpacking trip in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. We were gone for something like 3 days. We came back and the river had risen a lot, and that was because Naknek Lake had risen. And so we're seeing that affect sort of the early rise of the water level here. And you pointed out did you call it the bathtub ring?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the evidence that the water level is finally starting to drop off a little. It's getting a little bit lower. And we're starting to see that as the snowmelt is slowing down. I heard a rumor that termination dust was spotted on the mountaintops a few days ago.
You didn't see it yourself?
I didn't. Yeah, I don't know where I was, but I wish I had seen it.
So, yeah, you better explain this term, termination dust.
Right. The term termination dust refers to that sort of first dusting of snow that you might see up there in the mountaintops, indicating that summer is reaching an end and we are returning to the time of snowfall in Katmai National Park. And so
that feels about right on a day like today when the rain is whipping down and the wind is howling.
It's true. It's true. So you can imagine up in the higher mountains how cold it must feel. And if the rain is falling up there where it's cold enough, it won't melt off the mountains. It'll stay up there as snow. And so we might be reaching that time of year where things are just going to hang out up there in a frozen state until our next spring when things will melt away.
Okay, before we get blown away, I wanted to ask you a few questions about, we've been talking about big picture geology and how it's changing this area, but there's other kind of bits of geology that are interesting here. Fossils, right?
Yes, and I'm glad you said the word interesting too, because I agree. I think it's super interesting. What do you want to know about fossils, Daniel?
Well, some viewers are asking if you've ever seen bear ancestors or bear fossils or anything like that in the Lower River. Just basically, what kinds of fossils have been found in Katmai and maybe here on the river? Let's start with, have you found any bear fossils, I guess?
I never have.
Has anyone else?
Not that I know of. I don't think that we would find bear fossils. Fossils would indicate that a living thing had died and was preserved in the rock a long, long time ago. And so, as far as I know, we have no record of bear fossils. We will certainly find bear bones from time to time along the Brooks River here, but they're not in a fossilized state necessarily. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So then, but their fossils have been found.
They sure have.
But not of bears or their ancestors.
Not of bears. So there is I guess, a group of rock that geologists will call a formation of rock that's known for having fossils in it, and that's called the Geologic formation. And that's actually the rocky outcrop that, if you have seen Brooks Falls before, if you're familiar with the far side of the falls, usually where Bear 480 Otis is fishing, if you look to the right of where he typically fishes, you might see sort of a lighter outcrop of rock, and that's the Geologic formation. And it has a whole bunch of plant fossils in it. I was lucky enough to find a plant fossil on probably my first weekend that I was in Brooks Camp last year. And you said the word interesting with regard to fossils. I agree. I think they are super interesting. And I was really excited to find the fossil. It was a leaf imprint that I found. And there's also some petrified wood that you can find coming out of the Katmai Formation. So it's very possible to find either one of those things along the Brooks River or along the shore of Naknek Lake out there by Brooks Camp. Have you found any fossils?
In the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, I have found fossils, but not of plants.
Okay, what were they fossils of?
Sea creatures. Little clam-looking things.
Yes, yes. Maybe a bivalve, we could call it. Yeah.
That's a good name for it. But I liked what you said. You said that let me get this straight. Basically, if Otis were to give me some space and I was to go hang out down under the falls.
If he was able to tolerate you, yes.
Yeah. I could look at the rocks carefully, maybe pick a bunch of them up and examine them. There's a chance I might find fossils in those rocks right there.
I would say there is a chance, yes.
Okay.
Yes. That formation is known for having leaf fossils and, yes, possibly some petrified wood as well. But right, access up that way by the falls is probably a little bit more challenging, so I might recommend trying the shore of Naknek Lake first, Otis willing.
Yeah, and we have found, I've found fossils in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, but I guess there are fossils even here. We use gravel. I like to zoom in on the things I'm talking about. There's some gravel down there. That gravel comes from the area and not far from here. And I've found fossils in that gravel before.
Yeah.
So when we were making the gravel, or when the gravel was brought in, the fossils were just brought in along with it, and that was those little bivalves that I saw that. So if you're here in Brooks Camp and you're walking the path, keep your eye open for who knows, maybe you'll find a fossil right on the trail.
So true, yeah. And we're talking about this sense of change along the lower river here, and I think the farthest back we've gone in time so far was about 30,000 years to when the level of Naknek Lake was about 175 feet higher. But if we wanted to travel much farther back in time, to the times when those plant fossils were, I guess, formed, when the plants were alive that created those fossils, we would be talking about something maybe 50 to 60 million years ago. And
it's a lot longer ago.
A lot longer. And to sort of extend the scale, those fossils that you're talking about, those bivalves, the things that look like clams or mussels, that's from a group of rock that was formed almost 150 million years ago. And so, our park, Katmai National Park, has this great record of geologic history that spans many millions of years. And so it's fascinating to take something like the lower Brooks River here, where the sense of change, I feel like we can get a strong sense of that, but it is on such a smaller time scale. And being able to witness how bears adjust to that change, it makes me think about how on this greater geologic scale, life has changed with this changing environment.
Well, sorry, I just saw a comment that
bring it on.
Yeah, I've got the camera pointed out here at Naknek Lake, and we've been talking about all of this changing down here. People want your expertise, Ranger Becca. They want to know how the Naknek Lake is formed. How and why is there specifically? There's all these sections of Naknek River. So if you look at a map of it, you'll understand this, but we're only looking at one part of it here. Naknek Lake has many, I don't know, bays or arms, big areas.
Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning of this web chat that we are standing in a glacially sculpted landscape. And I think really to explain the formation of Naknek Lake, we'd have to begin with the story of glaciers, which many thousands of years ago completely covered the Alaska Peninsula, the area where we're standing. Glaciers extended from the peninsula out across the Shelikof Strait and covered Kodiak Island. They even extended all the way out into Bristol Bay. And so these really large bodies of ice are powerful enough to sculpt the land and the rocks beneath them. And so as glaciers flowed downhill from the mountains, they scooped out these U-shaped valleys. They probably followed the flow of river valleys and turned maybe a deeply incised V-shaped river valley into a broader floor with a more gentle slope, sort of a U shape. And then as those glaciers melt, of course, that melting ice has to go somewhere, so the water would fill those U-shaped valleys. So Naknek Lake is really sort of the footprint of where these glaciers have scooped through the land, creating these U-shaped valleys, and where the water has been held in them.
So the glaciers push the earth. They just scoop. I mean, they're really digging a massive amount. I mean, these lakes in parts are close to 1,000 feet deep, hundreds and hundreds of feet deep. They're pushing all of that earth up, and then that's how you get the moraines that we see, right? Like, so if you look out across Naknek Lake, we can't see it from here, but it looks a lot like what I've got the camera on now, just these kind of hills coming pushing their way into the lake. And this one that I have the camera pointed on was probably also somewhat glacially formed. That is just the end of the glacier pushing the earth up into a higher elevation, higher mound there.
Yeah, it's kind of like a snowplow coming through,
that's
just
a good
kind
way to
of
think of it.
scooping things up in front of it. And I've also heard glaciers compared to conveyor belts. They can transport rocks and other materials inside of the ice, and then at the place where the glacier melts, it'll just drop off that material. So it'll sort of end up in a pile there at that moraine.
Okay, well, here's another question from Bami. They just, real quick, we've been mentioning the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. For those who are new to this area, what is that?
Yeah, so the Valley of 10,000 Smokes is a volcanically devastated area that is just about 23 miles from where we are standing right now. And it was, in essence, the reason why Katmai first became a unit of the National Park Service. So in 1912, a volcano erupted. That volcano is called Novarupta, and its eruption was actually the largest of the 20th century. And it dropped ash and pumice on the area around us. The ashfall at Kodiak Island, which is 100 miles away, was about a foot thick. And on the coast of what is now Katmai National Park, the ashfall was maybe closer to 3 feet thick. And that volcano, Novarupta, in addition to the ash and pumice that it sent up and out, it also sent what's called a pyroclastic flow across a river valley. And so this flow of hot rock and gas filled in a river valley, and now it's sort of like a desolate moonscape. It's a really different landscape from what we see here on the lower river. And interestingly enough, we can find pumice from the Valley of 10,000 Smokes washing up on the shores of the islands that we see right out here. And so it's interesting to consider that, just 104 years ago in that volcanic eruption, there likely would have been salmon under the surface of the water like there is today. And if you can imagine the amount of pumice and ash that rained down on the Brooks River area,
probably wouldn't have been good for the salmon, I guess.
Indeed, yeah. There was certainly a negative effect on the salmon run that year. I can only imagine how the bears would have had to adjust their lives to such a catastrophic volcanic eruption. But despite that sort of destruction, here today we see a thriving salmon run, and we see a pretty epic bear population too.
Yeah, so that was in 1912.
That's
right.
right.
And that was really the start of this place in terms of it becoming a national park. But bears and salmon and people have been living alongside the volcanoes here for a long time. That wasn't a one-off thing, right? The volcanoes did erupt frequently, and it could erupt again, I suppose, right?
It sure could. Yeah.
Paint us a picture. What would happen to the lower river here if Novarupta were to erupt again, similar to its eruption in 1912?
Yeah, so that sort of scale of eruption is pretty large, and one that hopefully we wouldn't expect to see in our lifetime along the Brooks River here. But yeah, there's that possibility. So, there are rafts of pumice that you can sometimes see coming across the surface of the river or the surface of Naknek Lake, and it just looks almost like a foam at the top.
I'll try and zoom in on some over there.
Fantastic. Yeah, pumice is a rock that floats. It has these holes in it that were filled with gas, and now that's a rock that is not as dense as water, so it floats, and we can see that sort of washing up on the shores here. So imagine, if you will, just a whole lot of pumice and ash completely covering the surface of the river. A Nova Repta style eruption would have sent so much ash up into the air that it would have blocked out the sunlight for many days. And so, if you were a bear walking around the Brooks River and Nova Repta erupted again, well, I imagine you would probably want to go somewhere else, somewhere where you could see what was happening, somewhere where when you tried to smell your environment, you weren't inhaling volcanic ash, and somewhere where when you looked down into the water, you would be able to see the salmon that you were trying to catch, and you wouldn't just be looking down on pumice that was filling the waterway.
So do you think that if Nova Repta or a volcano were to erupt again, the bears would be able to adapt to a change that dramatic?
I think they've done it before. I think they could do it again. They are certainly a resilient animal, capable of changing their behavior if necessary in order to survive. So I think that if we did experience that again, as big a change as it would be, we might expect to see a recovering brown bear population in the future.
Okay, well, if Nova Repta was to erupt again, would you be excited or terrified?
Well,
or both?
I think, depending on where I was at the time, there would be a huge range of emotion. I think it is terrifying because volcanoes are certainly capable of creating wide sweeping change and destruction, displacing human populations, and we are maybe 30 miles or so from where Nova Repta is.
But we should say that people did live here when Nova Repta first erupted in 1912. This was not devoid of humans. People had to endure that, not just the bears and the salmon, but humans. And Ranger Sarah and I will actually be talking about that tomorrow at this time. So if you want to learn more about that, join us tomorrow at 3 on these cams. Well, before we start wrapping up, there was a handful of questions I wanted to ask you about fossils. That we only just got started on the fossil thing before we got sidetracked. Some people were asking about dinosaur fossils.
That's exciting because I really wanted to talk about dinosaur fossils.
Were there dinosaurs here in the past? I mean, I'm trying to imagine a dinosaur walking off of Mount Dumpling up there.
Right. That is quite a sight to imagine. What we can look for is a fossil record of dinosaur activity. And one of the groups of rocks, one of the formations that we see in this park is called the Naknek Formation. It's probably the one that gave you those bivalve fossils that you discovered, Daniel. And the Naknek Formation has yielded evidence of dinosaurs in other parts of the Alaska Peninsula. So no dinosaur fossils or footprints have been found within Katmai National Park yet. It's something that has been seen outside of park boundaries, and within that section of the Naknek Formation lies the possibility of discovering some dinosaur fossils. Katmai is not a place where every square inch has been explored and cataloged, so there is maybe a point in the future where we can say, yes, this park has some dinosaur fossils. It's interesting to think that in a place like Katmai, you maybe could come here and see evidence of dinosaurs and brown bears at the same time. I think that would make for a pretty exciting trip.
Some commenters wanted to ask if they could, if they find a fossil, can they put it in their pocket and take it home?
The answer is, if you find that fossil within the national park, no. Here in Katmai National Park, we want to preserve this resource so that future generations can come here and see these things as well. And so one of the things that is not permitted in the park is taking those fossils away. And that's one of the ways that we hope to preserve Katmai as a place for people to experience in the future. Maybe they could come here someday and find some fossils of their own. And that possibility only remains available if the people who come here now and the people who've been here before us leave this resource intact.
Right. And I guess that would go for the pumice and all the other rocks here as well that are pretty interesting rocks.
That's exactly right.
I got a good question. I don't think you can answer it, but I'd love to hear your thought anyway. imagine this: the Nova Rupta erupts again somewhere high up on the mountain above us here, and somewhere high up on the mountain above us, a bear is hibernating in its den. Do you think the bears could survive a volcanic eruption like Nova Rupta if they were already cozy in their den?
Interesting. So if they were sheltered enough, and I guess their den was solid enough that ashfall in their area wouldn't make their den collapse, and would still make it such that they could exit the den in the spring, maybe that part would be okay. I think then a bigger concern would be what does their food resource look like once they exit the den? Right.
So in the spring they'd need something to eat.
Yes.
And they'd need good water to be able to drink.
Exactly. And bears that are coming out of their dens in the springtime, a lot of them will eat vegetation before the salmon run really comes back. And if the ashfall is thick enough, it might actually extinguish some of the smaller plant life in the area. And so would bears be able to hold off until the salmon run maybe came back that year? I don't know for sure. It's an interesting thing to ponder.
They'd either have to hold off and wait till food resource came here, or they would have to travel far enough elsewhere.
Indeed. And as we've certainly discussed so far today, these bears are capable of making those sorts of adjustments.
They're very, very adaptable.
Indeed.
As we're wrapping things up, we can zoom in here, and I've got the camera on. We haven't seen too many bears while we've been chatting here, but we've got a sow and a cub down there on the shoreline. And it looks like they are on the lookout for salmon, as usual. So as we wrap things up here, I just wanted to say again that thanks for watching us, because the weather has not been the most cooperative, and we're here in a place notorious for its bad weather, the Alaskan Peninsula, pretty remote place here in Katmai National Park. And these cameras provided by Explore.org are all weatherproof and everything, so it's really not a big deal. The Explore.org cams allow us to enjoy these bears and this beautiful place, whether the weather is good or bad, and I think that's something I can be grateful for today. So join us anytime we are doing these in the future. We love to have you watching and asking questions. We'll be on tomorrow as well. Do you want to ask the audience a another question, or expand on the question that we started with? When we first started, we asked, what landscapes do you have to adjust to in your everyday lives? And there were some good answers. So if you haven't answered that yet, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you as an individual adjust to the changing landscape around you. All the rangers here definitely had to adjust to the landscape as it changed under our feet, as the corner, which is just about on the camera there, that over there, eroded away this year. We as rangers had to adapt, and it changed, just like the bears have to adapt and adjust to the changing conditions in the lower river. So answer that for us. What changes do you have to adapt to where you live? And we'll look forward to reading your responses in the comments afterward.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's great that even now we can watch a couple of bears using the lower river area here. Still, it's a place where they can come and find the food that they need in order to survive. And it's great that we can see that on the cam.
Okay, so this is Ranger Daniel and Ranger Becca signing off. Thanks for listening and watching with us today, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.